and inherent worth. Welcome, Hugh.
Thanks again. I should just stay up there right after that. Thank you. So the talk today is in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and it's also part of a series of talks I'm going to be giving this spring. I'm going to do 4 talks that offer an insight into certain aspects of ethical humanism that I think are at the core of what we're about. And this is the first one where I'm going to explain what I connect with the concept of inherent worth. Inherent worth, and I'm going to do so by comparing it to a term that Martin Luther King Jr. used that he called somebodyness. Somebodyness. It wasn't a technical term, it didn't show up a lot, but it was repeated in his writing. Now, many of you know about my 400-year project, and if you don't, please see me about that, but it's focused a lot of my energy. And much of the inspiration behind that project has come from Martin Luther King Jr., and he was taught by his parents to appreciate somebodyness. Professor Rufus Burrow Jr., author of God and Human Dignity, The Personalism, Theology, and Ethics of Martin Luther King Jr. In that book, he detailed how King had a positive, uplifting childhood, quote unquote, full of parental examples of showing the world that you should treat people with dignity. Now, the term dignity has a Latin root that's connected to the word standing. It's also linked to the capacity to stand tall, stand for something, stand for justice, and both of King's parents stood tall. During his childhood, he remembers being in a shoe store with his father when his father was asked to sit in the blacks-only section, and the father said, I am here as a customer, and I will spend my money only if you respect me. And King remembered that. He also remembered his father driving in a car when a police officer called out to him and said, "All right, boy, pull your car over and let me see your license." King recalled, quote, "My father replied indignantly, 'I am no boy.' Then, pointing to me, he said, 'This is a boy. I am a man, and until you call me one, I will not listen to you.' The shocked police officer quickly wrote him a ticket and left. So in the face of systemic oppression and the potential of being killed, King's father was courageous and dignified. His mother gave him a similar example. In 1961 Atlanta radio interview, Martin Luther King explained how despite tremendous systemic oppression, children can be raised with a sense of self-esteem. He explained, quote, "It seemed to me that the only thing that the mother can do, the Negro mother, is to try from the beginning to instill in the child a sense of somebodyness. This is what my mother tried to do. She made it very clear that in spite of these conditions, you are as good as anybody, and you must not fear that you are not." And this was her way of saying you should not have an inferiority complex. King continued, "Now this is very difficult because, even though you say these words, it's very difficult for the child not to develop unconsciously the sense of inferiority because he lives every day in the midst of a system which stares him in the face and says, 'You're less than, you're not equal to.' But I don't think I ever felt a conscious sense of inferiority. I always felt from the example and the words that my mother had given all along that I was somebody, and that all Negro people had dignity, even though the system of segregation deprives us of so much." Now, the impact of role models is tremendous. Most of you know that one of the most important reasons why people succeed, even though they are belittled and abused and suffer all their lives, is that when one person treats them with honor and dignity, they have the best chance of fulfilling their full potential. One person can make that difference. That was one of the reasons why Sesame Street, the children's public television program, had a guest on, civil rights leader Jesse Jackson, who offered a lesson on inherent worth and black pride. Do any of you remember his episode where he orated as only he could the poem, I Am Somebody? Anybody remember that? It was written in the 1950s, this poem, by Reverend William Holmes Borders Sr., and while Jackson often adapted it for various venues for what he was doing, for example, when he was speaking about Push Excel, which was his program for mentoring and encouraging black students, he would occasionally change the words. But on May 9th, 1972, he gave the poem as it was written. Jackson taught the children the poem beforehand, you could tell, because they were primed, and he used it at rallies and at marches when demonstrators were facing batons and tear gas. So I'm going to invite you to bring a little bit of the energy that might have been in that PBS studio back into this, that energy that went across the airwaves and into the homes and into the hearts and into the minds of children all across this country. So in a slightly edited manner, I invite you to repeat after me. I am somebody. I am somebody. I may be poor, but I am somebody. I may be young, but I am somebody. I may be on welfare, but I am somebody. I may be small, but I am somebody. I may have made mistakes, but I am somebody. My clothes are different. My face is different. My hair is different. But I am somebody. I am black, brown, or white. I speak a different language. But I must be respected, protected, never rejected. I am somebody. Now, was that fun? Should we do that a little more? I know responsive readings sometimes don't fit for some people because they've heard it in places that didn't work for them, so I'm wary about it at times. I'm also wary about things like I actually didn't read that poem as it was written. And the reason I didn't is that last line was not I am somebody, even though you get that rhythm going. The last line is actually in the poem, I am God's child. Now, I wrestled over whether or not to change that or not, because there are times at this place in ethical culture where I do change words, because we are a non-theist organization, and we're a home for people, whether they believed in God at one point or not, but people who aren't coming here to hear God talk. So I didn't want to have that in the poem. I thought it was something that would be like I was catching you. Like, you'd all be doing it, and I am God's child. So I didn't want to do that. But not out of a disrespect for the poem, but out of a respect for you. So I want to emphasize that. And I didn't want to tell you about it beforehand because I didn't want it to slow the pace or the cadence of this talk. But it's important to understand that for Martin Luther King, the religious connection, and for Jesse Jackson, the religious element was inherent in that poem. It infused King's life, his whole life, not just his speeches and his talks. Now, Richard Wills, in a 1911 book called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Image of God, explained it this way. He said, in its most basic form, King's appeal for civil rights was premised upon the theological fact of somebodyness. The understanding that everybody was somebody because everybody was created and conceived in the image of God. And he continues, irrespective of the ethnic origin, persons were defined by this shared sacred origin that merited serious, unbiased acknowledgement inasmuch as the image of God is assigned the highest degree of somebodyness and worth upon all human life. Now, Wills writes about how somebodyness countered the immoral tendency to stereotype and belittle other people. It opposed the erosion of human personality. He says, in essence, the concept of human life as dignified represented the bottom line insofar as the idea of mutual respect was concerned. It served as the universal invitation to to fulfill the so-called golden rule by treating others as they themselves would want to be treated. In keeping with this idea, Rufus Burroughs writes, "The universe is created in such a way that everybody ought to be treated with dignity and respect just because they are." Now, central to King's approach, Wills explains, was a belief that this innate worth, quote unquote, this innate worth, he uses the same words we use, this innate worth referred to in the phrase, the image of God, is universally shared in equal portions by all men and women. There is no graded scale for essential worth. There's no divine right of one race which differs from the divine right of another. Every human being has etched in his personality the indelible stamp of the Creator. Now, obviously, atheists and skeptics may not be comfortable with a theistic framing around somebodyness, but this framing is within the historical reality of the Black freedom struggle in America. Obviously, systemic degradation of people of color and of manual labor in general in this country weighed heavily on Black Americans. But it was in the Black church that for 150 years plus, many enslaved people found sustenance. It's where the Black abolitionist movement grew unfettered. And it's where the civil rights movement of this decade flourished. The fact that classism was involved and had to be overcome was highlighted by the founder of Black liberation theology, James H. Cone. He said, "The maids and the janitors, they were in charge in the church. They were on the deacon board. They were on the steward board. They were the ministers and such. So the church was the place that affirmed your somebodyness in a society that treated you as nobody." On the last day of his life, Martin Luther King was fighting for people treated as nobody. Or even worse so, they were treated as garbage. He was on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel the night of his assassination because he had come to support the Memphis sanitation workers. Danielle Brown wrote last year in the Washington Post, "The men King was defending worked in filth, dragging heavy tubs of garbage onto trucks. Most of the tubs had holes in them," said one sanitation worker, Taylor Rogers. This was in a documentary called At the River I Stand. Rogers continues, "Garbage would be leaking. When you went home, you had to stop at your door and pull off your clothes, and maggots would fall on you." Long hours, low pay, no benefits, and little respect. These men were treated like garbage. And in order one day to escape the effects of an oncoming storm, Echo Cole and Robert Walker crawled into the back of their truck with the garbage to avoid the storm. And some say that due to a lightning strike, the mechanism on the truck activated and the men were gruesomely crushed to death. Now, this horror, along with the lack of a compassionate response by authorities, on top of the already incredible poverty and oppression that haunted Black workers, this led to a strike. And the strikers wore placards with the fairly iconic phrase, "I am a man. I am somebody." James Douglas said, "We were going to demand to have the same dignity and the same courtesy as any other citizen in Memphis has." They declared that they were somebody by marching. And despite warnings not to go, King wanted to come and say, "You are somebody." Even though he was warned that there was a potential that he would be killed, he went to Memphis. His religious convictions about the dignity of every person, regardless of social status, drawn from his parents and from the history of Black church, was for King worth dying for. Now, other churches, some whose pews are filled with people of greater means, or at least people who have a certain degree of race privilege, also embrace inherent worth and dignity. The very early forms of universalism, well before the merger with Unitarianism, rejected the concept of original sin and eternal damnation. 19th century Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing put it this way. He said, "I do and I must reverence human nature. I shut my eyes on none of its weaknesses and crimes, but injured, trampled on, and scorned as our nature is, I still turn to it with intense sympathy and strong hope. I bless it for its kind affections, for its strong and tender love. I honor it for its struggles against oppression, for its growth and progress under the weight of so many chains and prejudices. Our own founder of the Ethical Humanist movement, Felix Adler, also thought we should have reverence for human nature. He did not want to treat each other cheaply. He said, "May the humanity that is within every human being be held more and more precious and be regarded with ever-deepening reverence." Today, the first principle of Unitarian Universalism is, quote, "the inherent worth and dignity of every person." One UU sermon by Hilary Landgraf-Krivchenia explained that you're not born fallen, you are inherently worthy. It isn't your occupation, gender, race, who you love, your wallet, IQ, or even your religion, but your own self that is worthy. In other words, external riches, external associations are not what make you worthy. You are worthy in and of yourself. Now, Adler taught this lesson. He compared two ways of seeing the world. Some of you know this already if you've been around here a while. One is called the worth paradigm, and the other is called the value paradigm. The value paradigm dominates our society today. People are judged in terms of their value relative to the projects of others. That's how marketplaces work. Excuse me. Marketplaces work this way. The value of a carpenter is determined by what you're willing to pay for their services. It just happens that way. Their value is subjectively determined by others. So, because of that, people can be ranked, they can be measured, and they can be replaced. They all have a price, so to speak. But according to Adler, quote, "a human being is not to be handled as a tool, but is to be respected and revered." This is the essence of the worth paradigm. Worth isn't determined by the marketplace. Worth is unconditional, irreplaceable, immeasurable, and priceless. You can't simply replace one person with another because every person is unique. They are somebody. In 1911, in an essay entitled "The Relation of the Moral Ideal to Reality," Adler explains the epistemological foundations of ethics, i.e., the sort of theory of knowledge basis. He says, "The worth of the individual person," he said, "is not discovered in the value of his empirical conduct, what he does in the world. He attributes worth to himself. He attributes it. It might not be obvious on the surface," Adler admits. We often judge people as less worth than they are truly worth. In fact, he talks about, in The Religion of Duty, a gold mine. He says, he uses this metaphor, he says that the field of the gold mine, underneath it, the goodness of humanity is the gold under the surface. He writes, "The spiritual nature of a rich mine, the upper layers of which have only been worked. Below, in the dark, unexplored region, lies the brightest, the most precious gold. The distinctions between one field on the surface above the mine are simply boundaries. Beneath, regardless of these external demarcations, lie the veins of gold." So he says we only need to mine the gold, the potential, the worth that is within every person. Earlier in this essay, Adler offers another metaphor of a mask. He talks about it in this thing. He says, "We shall learn to see and know the human beings with whom we come in contact from a new point of view, regarding them as masks behind which divinity lurks, as revealers of hidden potentials, of hidden spiritual possibilities. We shall attribute a certain greatness and sacredness to them, and the cheapness that now so often marks our estimate of those with whom we are familiar vulgarizing humor intercourse will disappear. We tend to not, on a daily basis, honor this worth. Behind these flowery words is the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. I'm sorry, I have to bring him up one more time. But he was a key influence in Adler's life because Kant, first of all, said that you can have ethics without religion. You don't have to have religion to have ethics. But he also believed that every human being should be treated as an end in themselves, never as a means, never as a tool. We shouldn't use people to achieve just our own goals. Human beings are not tools. They're worthy of respect for simply being sentient, rational, conscious creatures. So I see similar ideas in the writings of Jefferson. Ella sees it too. I want to give Ella a round of applause, by the way. How old is Ella?
7 months.
No 7-month-old has listened to me for this long. But I appreciate you bringing Ella in. So Ella would have, according to Thomas Jefferson, that all men and women and babies are created equal. They're endowed with their creator by certain inalienable worth, by certain inalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I find the term unalienable very important in that phrase because it emphasizes something from the Enlightenment that says that every individual has this dignity, these rights. They are fundamental. They're in their very existence. They have a right-bearing quality. It's so wrapped up in their essence that it can't be taken away. It's unalienable. They have inherent worth. You know, what does self-evident mean? For me, it means the same thing as 2 + 2 = 4. It tells to reason its own authority. I accept it without looking for evidence, just like I accept the worth of others without looking for evidence. It seems obvious. At least it does to me. But despite what seems obvious, we don't always act as if others have worth. Even on a relatively good day, we ignore people when people annoy us or when we think they're obnoxious. We can discard them. And worst of all, when we begin to see them as an enemy, we can attack them. And Adler was aware of this even in himself. He said, it was hard to accept the existence of repulsive traits in human beings, such as sly cunning, deceit, falsehood, grossness, and cruelty. We also forget about inherent worth because we are flawed, we're inconsistent. We're easily blinded by our passions, we're impatient, we're distractible, we're limited. And we dehumanize people when we fear them. But Martin Luther King turned the other cheek. When faced with the KKK, he resisted the urge to lash out, suffering insults and tear gas, hoses, guns, dogs, violence. He sought to uplift the very people who were oppressing him. His own dignity and courage was wrapped up in the respect of the worth of all. Now, before I turn towards my conclusion, I want to share something that I think is very important. Though you may want to say, it's philosophical hair splitting, but I don't think it is. Because some speak of inherent worth as if it's mainly a belief about the world. That for every person, their very existence has inherent worth. That their dignity is wrapped up in human nature, just like heat is wrapped up in the essence of the sun. You can't separate them. That's how I've framed a lot of my comments on worth today, that it's a belief about the world. And it resonates through King's speeches, and it's central to the Declaration of Independence, and it seems as clear as day. But I want to make an important point about ethical humanism, and that is, this is not just a detail, by the way. When Adler founded this movement, he was extremely knowledgeable about world religions, and he was very aware of the history of human civilization, and he was struck by how often differences in metaphysics and religious dogma led to catastrophic and violent conflict. He was determined to rise above this human tendency to let differences lead to suffering. And as he grew, he realized that often people don't always seem on the surface to have worth or dignity. Perhaps he's talking about a cruel father who was beating his children and taking the money they begged for. Or maybe he's talking about some captain of industry that abuse and pillage and crush people just for profit. And he became weary of searching for that gold beneath the surface with every person he ran into. So he began to say that ethical culture was about choosing to treat all people as if they were of inherent worth. Not about proving that every person had inherent worth. It was about a commitment towards action. And this shift away from why or how people have worth to acting towards people as if they have worth help avoid these conflicts. Because human beings have many reasons for believing that other people have worth. If you are today here, you may be a theist and you believe people have worth because they're created by God. Or maybe you're a Quaker and you believe people have worth because they have some of the inner light in them. Or maybe you're a Kantian and you believe people have worth if they're conscious and rational creatures. Or maybe you believe they have worth because you're a naturalist like I am and you look at apes treating each other well and think that that's part of our very being. Or maybe you just choose it because you believe it's an intuition. Or maybe you agree with Adler, who said, life is worth living if I support the worth in others. And if I find and enlarge the worth in myself. In other words, we add to our moral lives when we honor the worth of others and ourselves. So what's so revolutionary about ethical culture is that actions matter most. Actions are more important than why you treat each other with inherent worth. You don't even have to believe it. And I mean that. You have to commit to treat people as if they are of inherent worth. That's what matters to the person who's suffering. You have to treat them as if they inherit worth, as if they are unique, priceless, and irreplaceable, that the world would not be the same without them in it. This is the commitment I made when I joined Ethical Culture. We gather in a community to reinforce this belief in deed before creed. It's not that we discover the worth in others, all of us. Some of us do, but others don't. It's that we attribute it to them. We say that they are of worth, and we act towards them as if they are worth. It's about acts, not about facts. It's a choice. It's a commitment. It's a practice. And it's within this pragmatic framework that my work in ethical culture is guided. I have met other humanists of many sorts. Ethical humanists are just a tiny part of the humanist community, but in the broader free thought community, that they also share this approach. The Humanist Manifesto 3, which was signed by dozens of leading humanists in this country a couple of decades ago, put it this way. In 2003, created by the American Humanist Association, we are committed to treating each person as having inherent worth and dignity. To me, that's the best way to be in this world, to cooperate in honoring a shared commitment to inherent worth. That's what I think of when I look above the stage and say, the place where people meet to seek the highest is holy ground. It's where we meet to seek the best in each other, to seek it, to act it in our lives. Ella agrees. I conclude by returning to Dr. King. I think, like a Buddhist would remind us, ethics is not just about sacrificing ourselves for the world. Ethics includes a respect for oneself, a desire for self-improvement, to live the fullest life you can live. That's a part of it. It's one reason why Immanuel Kant actually had a prohibition on suicide, because he felt everybody had worth, so nobody should kill themselves. Now, we could have a debate on end-of-life suffering that I would differ with him on in that regard, but I think the essence of his point was true. It's as important to have respect for yourself as it is to have respect for others. In fact, if you don't, it's hard to truly practice a respect for the worth of others. When King was raised, his parents made sure that he had his own inherent sense of worth, a worth independent of his resources, of what he had, of what he could do, of what he could contribute. You are of worth. End of story. When he spoke in Cleveland in 1967, he said, in order to be truly free, the first thing we must do is to develop within ourselves a deep sense of somebodyness. Don't let anybody make you feel that you are nobody. Because the minute one feels that way, he is incapable of rising to his full maturity as a person. Professor Burroughs says, he draws attention to this aspect of Kant's philosophy. He said, one who recognizes a person as an end in himself and is sacred by virtue, by being imbued with God's image, or for whatever reason you want to say, is morally obligated to defend and enhance this dignity. In a 1901 lecture, Adler offered this hope to everybody. He said, may the humanity that is within every human being be held more and more precious, be regarded with ever-deepening reverence. The vice that underlies all vices is that we are held cheap, not by others, far worse, that in our innermost soul we think cheaply of ourselves. Of ourselves. You are inherently worthy. To conclude, a shorter version, I invite you to repeat. I am somebody. I am somebody. I am somebody. Thanks very much, everyone.